This is Gemara Yevamos Daf Samuch. All learning should bring in incredible. So Hashem so Chaim Dor Tam Zivu Bas Baruch Shalom Levizavo Vitali Shem Chaya Plum Yudis Bas Asima Malka as well as for Hashem Shal Yisrael and your faith Shmom Matila Naftali Sim Mechlas and Cham Bas Yiva Sar Blum Bas Mendel Chaim Bas Yeshua Ben Malka B'Shavegu Shelchana B'Seir Shar Chayle Yisrael. We pick it up on the bottom of Nunetes Amid Bees at the two dots. The Gemara says in Nasui. It's a bit of a unique two dots. Usually the two dots is quoting a Mishnah. Here it is quoting the aforementioned Brisa that we just finished off discussing yesterday. Excuse me. So let's go back up about 7 lines to the bottom of the Gemara and let's learn that Brisa together one more time. Tanu Rabban. Anusas atzmai mufutas atzmai lo yisa. We're continuing dealing with the dinim of a kohen gadol. If a kohen gadol himself is ma'anes or is mefata, rapes or violates, seduces, a girl, he is not allowed to marry that girl. But v'im nasui, if he marries her, they're considered married. We have to see what that means. That's today's discussion. Whereas anusas chaveroi mufutas chaveroi lo yisa, but v'im nasa tamachleikes v'las ben Yaakov imer avlad cholol and Rechama imer avlad kosher. So this is what we're going to deal with right now. Is what is the reason if he is ma'anes, if he is mafata a girl, that if and then he marries her, which he should not have done, they're allowed to stay married. So says the Gemara, Amar Ravuna explains Ravuna Marav Amoyitzi beget. It means the marriage works. The kedushin is chal. But is he allowed to live with her? Of course not. What does he have to do? He has to give her a get. Now whether this get is a din da'orais or din da'rabbanan is a point of discussion. But says Ravuna Marav, what do you have to do? He has to divorce this girl. Asks the Gemara, so what does it mean? He stays married. So Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Loimar, you know what it means? Shein, as we turn over to today's Daf Samach Chav and Aleph, Shein Mishalim Kenas b'Mifuta. He doesn't have to pay the requisite Kenas fine of Mifutas. And we look at the Tab Rashi. Tab Rashi explains, this is a discussion that we'll see in Ksubis in a few months, but says the Tab Rashi that if he's Mafata a girl, what happens? He has to marry her afterwards. And when he marries her, he does not pay the Kenas. So says our Gemara that when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, he's not supposed to marry her. But if he marries her, the marriage helps. That by Mefuta, he does not have to pay the Kenas. But of course, Rav Huna Marav is teaching us that he doesn't have to divorce her. Continues the Gemara and asks, also Rav Gavia Mibeksil. Rav Gavia Mibeksil went and Amr L'Shmai to come to Rav Ashi. He said this in front of Rav Ashi. And Amar Le, Rav Ashi said to him, what do you mean? But Rav Yechlan, Dami Tarvai, Rav and Rav Yechlan both said, this is what we saw yesterday. A Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a Baigaris. He's not allowed to marry a Mukas Eitz. But we continued and we said that and what was the reason by a Baigaris, by a Mukas Eitz, that if you do the wrong thing and you marry them, the Kohen Gadol, he's allowed to stay married. The reason is because either way, the girl's going to grow up, and either way, she's going to lose her basulim. So even though he did it wrongfully, he was not supposed to marry her, we see the marriage works. So what do we see? Asks the Gemara. In our case, either way, she's going to come a ba'ula. So just like by Mukas Eitz, just like by Gares, the halacha was don't marry them, but if you do, you'll let us stay married. And what it mean you let us stay married? It meant you let us stay married fully. Why you let us stay married fully? Because anyway, she's going to lose her basulim. Anyway, she's going to grow up. So says the Gemara, so too in our case. It's true he was manis and he was mafater, but either way, eventually through marriage, he's going to sleep with this woman and she's going to come a ba'ula. So we see that the nasi is a real nasi. Sounds like you could actually stay married, and says the Gemara, Kasha, this is indeed a good question. Continues the Gemara, and the Gemara says, Anusas chaveroi mafutas chaver lo yisrael and nasav los ben Yaakov and Vlad Cholov Chamer and Vlad Kosh. Quoting the Gemara, the end of the Brisa, that what happens if there's a girl that was manes from Rafata by someone else, the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry her. But what happens if he does? A machlekes, what is the status of the child? The Chachamim said the child is a kosher, whereas Husband Yaakov says the child is a chol. And this all comes from the fact, as we're going to see in a moment, Xeris HaKasav, that the Torah teaches us that a Kohen Gadol has to kim besula me'amav yikach isha. He has to marry a besula. So explains the Gemara Amar Avuna Marav again. Halacha Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. He says halacha is the child of chol. V'chein Amar Rav Gidol Marav halacha Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. Ikati Amri Amar Avuna Marav. My time with Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. What's the reason of Rav Elazar ben Yaakov that when the Kohen Gadol marries the nusas chaver mafutzas chaver, the child is a cholol? Because of Rav Elazar. Who is Rav Elazar? So Rashi tells us from tomorrow's daf. Rav Elazar is the opinion that holds Pani Abba Penuya. We actually saw this yesterday. That if a single guy and a single girl have relations together, Shaloi L'Shem Isha's not for marriage. What's the halacha? Sa Zaina. Once she becomes a Zaina, it's a lav, an Isser Daraisa to live with her. And Machayve lav, in any time a Kohen is together with someone that's an Isser Daraisa of a lav, the child is a Chol. So the reason why we paskin like Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, that the kid's a Cholol, is because he also like Rav Elazar, that Panei Abal Benuya, the child is going to be a lav. Asks the Gemara 1 second, and we several cover say, but does Rav Elazar ben Yaakov actually hold like Rav Elazar? But Kaimlan, we hold Mishas Rav Elazar ben Yaakov Kavinaki. Rav Elazar ben Yaakov's Mishnayos were pure, we're pristine, we're always la halacha. Vilu Baha, and yet in this case, Amarav Amarav ain't halacha like Rav Elazar. So if the whole impetus to Baskin like Rav Elazar ben Yaakov is because he's going like Rav Elazar, and Rav Elazar ben Yaakov is usually Kavinaki, what he says stands. But ask the Gemara, we know we don't Baskin like Rav Elazar. So it's no longer Kavinaki, it's no longer pure and pristine because we're not Baskin like Rav Elazar. It says the Gemara for the second time today, Kasha, that is indeed a good question. Continues the Gemara, another way of learning up the Machlekes Rav Elazar ben Yaakov and the Chachamim Rav Ashi Amar. The point of dispute when the Kohen Gadol marries Anusas and Mafutas Chaveira is Cholol mechayve asei kamifliki. Says Rav Ashi, you know what the Machlekes over here is? The Machlekes is there a Cholol from a Chayve Asay? What's the Asay? So Rashi over here points out Rav Elazar ben Yaakov does not hold like Rav Elazar that it's a la, and therefore she is not a Zaina, and there's no lav. So what's the Asay? As we pointed out, Kim Besula me'amav yikach isha. Kohen Gadol has to marry a Besula and not a Beula. And Velav Abba Mechal say we learn out and not a Beula. Whenever we learn out a negative commandment inferred from a positive commandment has the status of an Asay. So when a Kohen Gadol is over this Asay, what is the status of the child? Says Rav Ashi, that is the point of dispute. Does that create a Cholol or not? Rav Elazar ben Yaakov Savri Yesh Chol Mechayve Asay and Rabbanan Savri Ein Cholol Mechayve Asay. And that is the second way of learning up this machlekes. But now says the Gemara, after having two different ways of learning out what the machlekes is, ask the Gemara, my time with Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. Where did Rav Elazar ben Yaakov get his din that in this case it's going to be a chol, and this really is piggybacking off of Rav Ashi's teretz. The Rav Ashi just taught us that it's an asay, it's a lava ba mechal asay. So ask the Gemara, why does Elazar ben Yaakov hold that such a scenario the kid is a chol? Explains the Gemara, the Chsiv, it says in the Torah, al mana gusha v'chalol zayna zila lo yikach kim besula me'amav Yikach Isha Uksiv, and the Torah follows it up. As you see on the side over here, the next pasuk says the Torah of Leichal Zarei Be'amav, and therefore says of Elazar ben Yaakov Akulu. It says V'lo Yichalel, that the kid will be a chalul. That's going on everything, and therefore if he's over on this asay, the love of Machal asay, even if he goes and he marries Anutas Mavutas Chaveroi, the halacha is the child's going to be a chalul. Says of Elazar ben Yaakov, and this is within the second teretz of Rav Ashi. The Rabbanan who hold the kid is not a chalal. What do they do? It's seemingly it's a very shabasuk. It says that v'lo yichalel. Explains the Gemara, Eila, if the Kehini and the Rabbanan hold that the word Eila, these, splits it up and shows me that's not going back and making it a chal. For Elazar ben Yaakov, Amar Eila lemutei nida. No, Elazar ben Yaakov says the word Eila doesn't necessarily just split it up. Rather, what does it do? It comes to exclude only these and not what? And not a nida. Explains the Gemara, that is the basic machlekes in Elazar ben Yaakov and the Rabbanan. So ask the Gemara, come on, the Tanya. Who does the following brisa go like? Says the brisa, me eila atois cholol. From these eila you have a cholol. V'atois cholol minida, and there's no cholol from an ida. So whose opinion is this? Kiman, Rav Elazar ben Yaakov. That's Rav Elazar ben Yaakov that's saying that leila only these cases creates a cholol. Ask the Gemara. According to Rav ben Yaakov, if the word Eila is not splitting up the parasha, it's just coming to limit. So why doesn't it say it at the end of the parasha? Kasha, and for the third time today, I think it's a bit of a unique Gemara to have three kashas. Of course, we know kasha doesn't mean there's no terutzim. The Rishonim always deal with it. Tiyofta means there's no teretz. Kasha means there's a teretz. Says the Gemara, indeed, it is a question. Tana Rabbanan, and now that basically ended off the brisa from yesterday. Anusas atzmai, mefutas atzmai, anus chaveroi, mefutas chaveroi. The two parts of the brisa from yesterday. Now Tana Rabbanan begins the Gemara about 20 lines to the bottom. The first word line is lo eila. Says the brisa, achoisai arusa. We know that a kohen is allowed, a kohen hadit is allowed to be matame only to the shiva krivim, to 7 relatives. One of those relatives, of course, is a sister. The question is, once the sister gets married, Nisuin, full-fledged marriage, no longer does her brother be metameter. But what if the sister only did Erusin? That's the discussion. So Tanu Rabbanan Achloisai Arusa, when she does Erusin, Machlaikis Rameir, Rav Yudaimer metamela, you can still be metamet. Rav Shimon Aimerim, a metamela. So part A Machlaikis is, can you be metamet too? The sister who after she does Erusin, Machlaikis Ramir and Rav Yudah says yes, Rav Shimon says no. Continues the brisa. Anusa umefuta. If there is a sister who had been violated or seduced, anusa mefuta. Devrei hakol. Now everyone all of a sudden agrees. Eimetamela. Case number 2. Case number 3. Umukas eitz. What if the mukas eitz, which we spoke about yesterday, is that she loses her basulim, she loses the hymenal blood via an external factor, not naturally, not via relations. Ein metamela. Divi Rav Shimon. Let's just point out, in the first case of the Raisa, it was Rav Yossi and Rav Shimon together that a metamela. Here by Mukas Eitz, it's just Rav Shimon saying a metamela. Why? Says the Raisa, Shahaya Rav Shimon, Aimer, really going to the metamela, she really going to a metamela. You can only be metamela to sister if the sister is Rai to Kohen Gadol, and a Mukas Eitz is not Rai. Din number 3 in the Raisa. And finally, din number 4 of the Raisa, Umaygare as metamela da divrei kol adam or divrei hakol. Everyone agrees that when the sister is a bagaris, even though she's at some level doesn't have her basulim, everyone agrees you're allowed to be mitamit to her. So 4 cases of the brisa, and now in classical Gemara sense, we're going to go through one by one. So says the Gemara, my time there may Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda that said by Achaisei Arusa, you're still allowed to be mitamit to her. Why? Explains the Gemara, the Dar Shachi, to learn the Psukim as follows. Ula chaisai habisula pralanusa. Says the Torah, the sister who is a besula, that comes to exclude anusa. And within the drushes right now, we're not going to only learn about arusa that did Erusin in the first stage of marriage. We're going to point out other dinim along the way in how Ramir and Rav Yehuda darshan up the Torah. So number 1, it says in the Torah absula, which explains the Gemara comes to exclude an anusa. Umefuta. Continues the Gemara that excludes an anus and mafuta. Why? Because they are not besulais. Maybe also should exclude that you cannot be metame amukas eitz, and we'll point out which is indeed the din of Rav Shimon. Says the Brisa, no, that wasn't Tameh Mishav. And we explained already, she lost her Basulim, nothing to do with a man. And therefore, according to the first opinion of Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda, says the Gemara, you can yes be metamet to a mukaseitz. Continues the pasuk. Hakraiva has to be a sister who's close to you. What does that teach us? The rabbi's arusa. There it is. Comes to include an arusa. That's what we're looking for. According to Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda, because the Torah says achaisei akraiva, even if she did Erusin, but she's still karaiv to you, you can be metamet her. Continues the pasuk. A love l'rabbi sabagaris. Continues the pasuk. a love the rabbis Abigaris. And that's the end of the brace. Says the Gemara on this last drasha, Alam Likra. Why do we need a pasuk by a Abigaris to say that you could ask me metamilor? Valmer Meir Besula Filu mixes Besulim Mashma, that when the Torah used the word Besulim, that your metamit of Besula means any level of Besulim, and a Abigaris still has some Besulim, so of course you should be metamiter. Explains the Gemara. 4 lines from the white lines. It's the Rechsaka that the Chamina Nil of Besula Meyasa. Maybe you should learn out from the Shivcha that was Ma'anist, Malahalin Naira, Afkanami Naira, and not Abigaris, Kamashlan, that even Abigaris, he could be metamiter. So we just learned the source that you could be Makdamit Abigaris. We just learned that the Naira Achaise Arus, he could be metamiter according to Rameh and Rav Yehuda. Now, who argues on Rameh and Rav Yehuda? Rav Yasi and Rav Shimon. So says the Gemara of Rav Yasi and Rav Shimon, my taimayu, what do they hold? That achaisay arusa you cannot be metame. Explains the Gemara, the Darish Achi, they learn as follows in the first Y line. Ula achaisay absula. What does the Torah mean when it says your sister is the besula? Pratlanusa, that excludes one that was violated, umafuta and seduced. Umukaseis, and as well it comes to exclude Amukasates, that all of these women are not achaisei besula. They all lost their besulim, and none of these you could be metamet to. Hashalo aisa leish, continues the pasuk, prat la arusa. So according to Rav Meir and according to, Rav Yossi and Rav Shimon, now they say no. Hashalo aisa leish excludes the arusa, and then hakarayva is the rabbi's what? Because according to the first opinion, hakarayva it was the rabbi's arusa. According to Rav Yossi and Rav Shimon, arusa is excluded. So what do they do with the pasuk of hakarayva? The rabbi's arusa shenis garsha elov. Excuse me, shenis garsha comes to exclude an arus which is Megaresh. And Aros, meaning of 2 stages. She did Erusin and then Gerushin. A love, the rabbi says Abigares. Says the Gemara, and what does a love do? A love comes to include a Baigares. Hakraiva, according to Rabbi Yisrael of Shemin, the rabbi said Rusa Shenis Garsha. So excuse me, that's already going back. So that's the end of how Rabbi Yisrael of Shemin learn. They argue on Rameh and Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yisrael of Shemin learn Chaisei Arusa. Says Rabbi Yisrael and Rabbi Shimon. Says Rabbi Yisrael of Shemin, Chaisei Arusa you cannot be metameter. Says the Gemara, 1 second. What was the last Rasha? Hakraiva was the rabbi's arusa sheniskarsha. According to Rav Yossi Rav Shimon, the word hakraiva came to include arusa sheniskarsha. Ask the Gemara, 1 second. What happened to Rav Shimon? Rav Shimon and this girl is not Rayu to Kohen Gadol. Since she had Geirushin, the halacha is she's not Rayu to Kohen Gadol. So therefore, once is a Rusav and Gerusha, according to Rav Shimon, of course you cannot be metameter. Explains the Gemara, you're right, but this breaks the rules. Rav Shimon normally holds it all has to do if you're right to the Kohen Gadol. But over here, because it's a special pasuk of Hakroiva, that breaks the rules. Iachi asks Gemara, 1 second, if you're breaking the rules, Mukas Eitz Nami. Rabbi, why don't we say the same thing by Mukas Eitz, that Hakroiva comes to include Mukas Eitz? Explains the Gemara, no, Kroiva Achas L'Shtayim, the word Kroiva can only come to include 1 and not 2. Ask the Gemara, my Rois, how do you know anytime we have 1 exclusion and 1 inclusion? We always want to know, how do we know 1 is included and 1 is excluded? Explains the Gemara, fundamental difference between Arusa Sheniskarsha and Mukaseitz. By Mukaseitz, it's true that we explained it on an Aleph. It wasn't an action done by a man. It wasn't Havyasai al Yideish. But a Mukaseitz was an action done there. There was an external force that removed their Besulim. Whereas the Arusa Sheniskarsha, there was no action done. And therefore, it makes more sense that she, yes, could be metameter. And now we continue. Rav Yossi, and according to Rav Yossi, as we pointed out, that when it came to Mukas Eitz, it said only Rav Shimon. What happened to Rav Yossi? For the fact that it left out the Bar Zuge, his pair, didn't say Rav Yossi. Sounds like Rav Yossi holds like Rameir with regard to Mukas Eitz, that you, yes, can be metame. Where does Rav Yossi know this? Explains the Gemara, for the fact it says he's not been with another man. Ask the Gemara, wait, Rav Yossi already used this pasuk as we explained in the bottom of Amud Aleph. Explains the Gemara, Chan Melaisa V'Chan Meleish. Two different drushes from two different words. A love, we said at the end of the rice on the bottom of the Manalef, the rabbis have a Geras. Comes included by Geras. Ask the Gemara of Amar Rav Shimon Besula Shlema Mashma. That Rav Shimon holds that the word Besula, this goes back to yesterday's discussion, refers to a full-fledged Besula, and a Geras is not a full-fledged Besula because she lost her Besula at some level. Explains the Gemara, 10 lines down, the first line is Taima. Taima didei nami hasam. Taima didei nami hasam mei hacha. His reason over there by the Kohen Gadol really comes from over here. The Darish hachi, because he learned over here, midei love, the rabbis have a geres. So that's how he learns Bechlal the Besula in general, Besula Shlema Mashma. Meaning, caused by us that a love breaks the rules, that's inherently how he knows that the word Besula refers to a full-fledged Besulim. And that's the end of this second discussion of today, the discussion about Achaise Arusa, which we thereby got into all the other cases of Ulikayin, it could be Metameh too. Continues the Gemara, Tanya, we learned in our Bryce about 12 lines down, the first one line is Besula, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai Omer, Giyoris V'chuz V'shal Shanav Yamechad Ksher Likuna. A statement of Rashbi, a Giyaris, a girl that is Megayer less than 3 years old in one day, is allowed to marry a Kohen. How do I know? It says in Shimon Bar Yochai, She'enamar v'cholatav v'nashim v'shaliyadu mishkav zachar. Says in the Pasuk with regard to Midiani girls that they took captive after the war with Klal Yisrael, all the children that the woman that have not known a man, mishkav zachar, lying with a man, hechyu lachem, you should keep them alive, and you could be with them. Says Achiu lachem, for you, which shows us they're allowed to be for you. You're allowed to take these captives as a wife. The soldiers were allowed to take them as wives. And explains the Gemara who was one of the soldiers. Pinchas. Pinchas, who was a Kohen, was one of the soldiers. So we see that the Kohen, Pinchas, is allowed to take one of these Midiani girls as a wife. So now, what must the reason be? Seemingly because she is just than 3 years old in one day. And this is our source that we have a Giyaris less than 3 years old in one day. You're allowed to marry a Kohen for the fact that Pinchas married the captives of the Midiani girls. The Rabbanan who argue, and they say you're not allowed, they say that any time you have a ger, you're allowed to marry or even older than 3. What do they do with this pasuk? They learn that pasuk is talking about Avadim and Shvachais, not that you're actually marrying these girls, you're taking them as slaves. Ask the Gemara, if you're going to tell me according to the first opinion, according to Rashbi, that the girl was less than 3 years old in one day, and that's the raya, that a Kohen is allowed to marry such a Giyares. Ask the Gemara, even if she's older, she should be allowed. Where do we see in this pasuk that it was dafka specifically the girls were younger? Explains the Gemara, the Ravuna Rami, we have a contradiction in Psukim. It says any woman that was with a man you have to kill. If they weren't with a man, you keep them alive. We see that the obvious implication is that when it comes to the children, whether they were or not with men, whether there was a man that was with them, you're allowed to keep them alive. But a different pasuk says, the implication is that if they were with a man or ugly, you have to kill them. So we have a contradiction in Psukim, and from there we learn out. Yomer explains the Gemara. That's the difference. That's how we know the difference is going to be, whether the girl is 3 years old or not. And Tanami Hachi says the Gemara, we have a brisa that supports this. How do you know when it says it means they're fitting to have tashmish? Maybe it means they actually had tashmish. When the Torah says so says the Gemara, that is how we know to differentiate in the Psukim whether the girl was 2 years old or not. But now says the Gemara, a technical almost question. Minayadi, 4 lines from the medium-sized lines. How do they know which of the Midiani girls were younger than 3 years old and thereby allowed to marry a Kohen? It says the Gemara, Avuna, they knew Bar Biznam, Rav Shimon Chasida, Avir Levnei Tzitz. They took the girls, they made them pass by the tzitz of the Kohen Gadol, and called Shepaneo, Merikais, if their face turned a bit greenish. You know that they are of age to have to hashmish over 3. Koshena Banav Merikais Biadua. And says the Gemara based over this din on the first medium side line of Rav Nachman, simin la'aveira adrakan. We see from this story that what's a simin of aveira? What's a simin of someone who had relations? Is adrakan is this disease is when they turn a bit green. And similarly, says the Gemara, Gemara that we'll see in Ksubis shortly, says the Basai vayimsu miyosha Yavish Gilad arba miyos nara besula. They found amongst those of Yavish Gilad 400 girls who were besulais. Asher lo yadu ish mishkav zachu, who never with together with another man. Says the Gemara, Minna Yadi. In the story of Yavish Megillat, how do they know which of the girls were together with a man or not? How do you know she's a Besula? Amar Rav Kahana, Yeshiva al Pi HaChavos, you know what they did? They took these girls, they sat them on top of a barrel of wine, Shal Yain. If she had relations, and therefore she was opened up by Isamakam, the wine would go through her. And what would happen? Her breath would smell like the wine. Besula, she's closed up, Ein Reicha Noidev. So a very similar way of testing if the girl is a Basula or a Baula. But says the Gemara, 1 second, but I've riddle of they tits. Why you say them on top of a barrel of wine? Why do you do the same test by us? Put them on top of the tits. Amar of kind of Ram Nasan, Lirotzain Lahem Ksiv. What does it say by the tits? It says the Kohen Gadol is wears the tits, Lirotzain, to find favor of Hashem. Ksiv, Lirotzain Lepranias. And therefore we only use the tits to show Ratzain, and not to show which of these Binyani girls, which of these people by Yavish Megilad are chayiv punishments. Iachi asked the Gemara, Nami, why do we say the same thing by Midian? Amar Ravashi, Lahem Ksiv, Lahem the Ratzah Lepranis, Balaakim Afilu Lepranis. When it comes to the Goyim, even for Pranius, when it comes to the Yidin, then it is only Lahem. We'll conclude with Amar Ravakar Yidi, Amar Rav Shimon Levi Alach, Rav Shimon Yochai. This is indeed the halacha. Again, this Rav Shimon Yochai that we learned the tab over here, that Rashbi taught us that Geras B'chuz B'Shal Shanav Yom Echad is Kishera Leke Huna. And we'll pick it up in Mirz Hashem from Rav Zera. Actually, no, let's continue. We have a little bit longer. How do you know that we paskin like Rashbi that a Kohen is allowed to marry a ger that is megayer less than 3 years old? Says the Gemara, my klal, what would the inference be? There was a city in Eretz Yisrael in which there was an error, there was a protest against whether the people in that city were kosher. Vishaga Rebbe is Rebbe Rumnis. And Rebbe sent Rumnis to look into the matter. And he found a girl who was megayer less than 3 years old one day. And he said, Rebbe Lakuna. And Rebbe said, she's allowed to stay married. So what do we see? We see from this story that, like Rosh Yochai, so this would be the inference from the fact that Rebbe paskind that they can stay married if she was megayer less than 3 years old, is the inference we pask like Rashbi. And Amar Lei, and now he says, really, beferish Mili. I heard it explicitly that we pask like Rosh Yochai. Says Gemara, who cares? Let's say you only knew it as an inference. Explains the Gemara, maybe in the case of Rebbe, she already got married. And if that's the reason why we'll let them stay married. The Rav Yochanan as we saw today in the top of Amid Aleph. They taught us the Kohen Gadol is not supposed to marry Bageres and Mukazis. But what happens if they do? And therefore it says the Gemara thinks the Gemara, so too by us. Maybe the reason we allow them to stay married is because they already got married. Says the Gemara, what's your comparison? As we've said over there, either way she's going to lose her Basulim. In our case, we're going to let them stay married. Is there a reason to say that she's for sure going to be a Zaina? And therefore, if it was only a Klala, it was only from an inference, we would not necessarily have a Raya. And Rav Savra Masla Mechlala, Vikashale, like we just said, and he answered like we just explained. And we'll pick it up from Hu Kahana Mirz Hashem in the next year.